So now we will move into the clinic session. And for the clinic session, I would like to introduce Dr. Senda Driss to you. Dr. Senda Driss is the head of the ALS Clinic Center here at Northwestern. She is a very good friend of mine, and she's my elderly sister, if you wish. And we've been very close, so close that she heard me snoring. So this is as close as you get in a university setting. And she's been always very knowledgeable and down to earth. And she's a connector. She brings people together. She loves patients. She wants to help anyone, everyone, as much as she can, all the time. And I'm thrilled to be her friend and to be her colleague. And I would like to introduce Senda Driss, Dr. Senda Driss, to kick off the clinical session.
Thank you, Hande. Thank you for your nice introduction. You are very kind. I do not deserve all that praise. Thank you very much. So we're going to move on to the clinical session, and we are fortunate to have Dr. Brown stay with us. So for some of you who still have questions, there'll be an opportunity to ask them, and I'll be there to answer them. But in this clinical session, I'll be joined by 2 other people and a moderator. So let me start by introducing Dr. Lisa Wolf. Dr. Wolf is a professor of pulmonary medicine and sleep medicine, and she's really taught me everything I know about taking care of ALS patient respiratory-wise. She really dedicated all her work to making sure that neuromuscular patient and ALS patient in particular take an easier breath every single day. We are fortunate to have Dr. Wolf with us today, and she's also a very dear friend, and we always joke that we cannot ever leave this place because we'll have to go together. There is no way I can do my job without her behind it.
It's true.
We always joke about that. The other person that will join us today is Lauren Webb, and I've known Lauren very long time ago, and Lauren has really the power of bringing people together. So what she did very early on is help me get the Chicago neuromuscular people together over dinner and discuss cases or presentations. So she was our very first sponsor for this activity. Lauren has a first seat to clinical trial in neurology. She was there when the very exciting drugs like Spinraza and Duchenne muscular dystrophy gene therapy were being developed as a clinical research coordinator at Lurie. So she's lived through that and know it as very well. And from there, Lauren moved to the MDA to become the director of clinical service. And finally, she's with us as the director of support service and education at Les Turner. And Lauren is here with us today. You'll be able to ask her question. And then last but not least, Dr. Franz, who's our moderator. He wears multiple hats, but mainly he's a physician scientist. He's a physiatrist and a neuromuscular specialist. He's one, I could say, one of the rare male who will listen to both of us, Lisa and, and myself. When we whispered in his ear to kind of, it would be good for him to do a neuromuscular fellowship. So Dr. Franz is also the director of the EMG lab at Shirley Ryan and the director of the regenerative neurorehabilitation at Shirley Ryan as well. So he'll be our moderator. He'll be the one sending us the question in selecting them. So we're ready.
This is great.
I don't know if you have Dr. Brown, he can also put his camera on so we know he's helping us.
Okay. And if there's a bit of an echo, I might just have Dr. Wolf silence your microphone. Perfect. We're in a large room, but nearby. So thanks for the introduction. We're going to get right started. There's a lot of questions, and we'll start with some of the ones that were pre-submitted. And I'm going to direct one to Dr. Brown to begin with, and the first one, and then we'll kind of move it around and just sort of flow with as questions come in on the Q&A, we'll try to get to those too. So Dr. Brown was amazed by presentations today, especially his. And but one of the things, since he wears both hats as a clinician and as a researcher, is expanded access programs. And it's come up more and more in my clinical practice, and I haven't been around that long, and I'm sure patients are always curious about, you know, how do we feel about it as researchers, as clinicians? Could you comment a bit on expanded access programs and the pros and cons?
Yeah, it's tricky. I will say that I believe in finding a pathway for expanded access, provided that the usual pathway for verification, validation, or testing of a drug is not in any way compromised. So that may sound like a bit of a hedge, but the reality is we have to have studies with appropriate design and some sort of placebo control to know if a drug works. And as long as that is underway, then I think to the extent that additional studies can be done of an extended access nature, they're very much to be desired. There's a lot more one can say, but that's the core response.
Perfect. And anyone else have a comment about expanded access?
As physician, we encourage it as long as, I agree with Dr. Brown, it's done the right way. There are two things that we want to make sure that patient understand. The expanded access or the compassionate use is different from the right to try. The compassionate access, expanded access means that there is oversight from ethic boards and from the FDA, whereas the right to try, there is no oversight at all. The other thing that the patient need to understand is not every compound is ready for expanded access. For example, sometimes we don't even know the dose. There are dose finding studies that are being done to understand that. So usually it's compounds that are in late stage of development that will be amenable to expanded access. And we do rely on pharmaceutical company to give the drug for free so we can try it. So there is those things that we have to figure out. Also, we will need some kind of funding to cover what we do to get this compound accessible to the patient. So of course, we would like to see a day where every single ALS patient will be eligible for one kind of therapy, whatever it is, but it has to be done the right way.
And just one other thing real quickly is that as we move more and more to bespoke methods for designing genetic therapies, we're going to have some way of saying that the trial will be done on the method and not the exact drug, so that we can allow just in time bespoke generation of personalized genetic therapies. But we're a long way from that.
And I just wanted to add about expanded access. I think it's really important for companies to start to plan for that early on and to really start to think about what their expanded access program looks like. So that's part of it. So it really, hopefully that it becomes more baked in and as part of a larger clinical trial program for the pharmaceutical companies.
And it's happening now. It's happening more in the past 2 years, actually, which is very encouraging.
This is Lisa Wolf, just one other thing with that, and this is to address Lauren's issue. You know, part of the job that Dr. Driss, Dr. Franz, Dr. Brown have is that as trials are being designed, that they're the trial advocates. In other words, when the trial contracts are being signed, the obligation of the company for expanded access and extended access has to be signed in the beginning, because those costs that Senda was talking about should not be thought about after. They should be thought about before, and we need to be the advocates to do it up front.
Yeah, and I'll just end on a note, because I remember my first taste of this. I immediately started trying to help someone down this path, and then within a day, I realized they needed help and had to go to Dr. Driss because of the amount of resources. So this isn't something that can really feasibly be taken on by a lot of different physicians out in the world if you don't have a research infrastructure and a lot of people working with you. I don't know how we could have even got through the expanded access requests that we had done. There's just things that you couldn't even fathom just as a regular physician that come up. So anyways, I think, will we say that the feelings though from the group are, with the caveats aside, generally positive about the program? Yeah, I agree. And so there was a concern, I think, raised in the questions I was getting about maybe that some of us would be against them or skeptical, but I don't think that that's the impression I get from any of the panelists or my other colleagues. I have a second question about ALS clinics that I want to direct to Dr. Driss. And it was very specific. Someone was asking a bit more details about the history of our clinic and how many patients we serve in the Chicagoland area, and but also compared to the total number in the United States. Maybe you could comment on that, and we can.
Yeah, I can try. So I think we're one of the very first multidisciplinary ALS clinic in the country. It was established in 1986, I think, and we've been very busy. We've seen always about 80% of the ALS patients in the greater Chicago area. As on average, we see about 100 new ALS patients a year, and then we carry about 400 patients that we've been seeing through the years. I mean, in the US, I think there is about 30,000 patients living with ALS, so about like 5,000 new patients a year. So it's a fraction of the big number, but yeah, I think that's about how many we see.
Perfect. I think that you obviously knew the answer to that question, so I figured I'd direct that one to you. And then the next question I had was one for Dr. Wolf. Just came in on the Q&A, so I thought I had another one for you, Dr. Wolf, but I like the spontaneity of taking them live. Technology to detect early respiratory disease in neuromuscular patients, particularly ALS. Could you comment on what's emerging and how we might make, because to Dr. Brown's point is we diagnose patients late. What can we do to assess these changes earlier?
So I'd like to tell a couple of different stories that have happened over the last year. When COVID first happened, it was very challenging because we typically bring people into a pulmonary function lab to assess their lung function, but we couldn't do that because PFT labs were closed. COVID testing was scarce. And so since we needed to COVID test before doing that, it really limited what was going on. One of the big changes that was made is the development of remote oxygen sensing. And so we were able to use a device. There are a couple on the market. We actually used one that was called the WatchPat, which allows us to use your regular cell phone and a device that we can mail the patient. They can monitor their overnight oxygen saturations, and through the cell phone, they just hit send and we can see how they're doing without the patient ever leaving the house, which means that we were able to take care of patients through COVID and get them started on therapy when they needed to. So that's been one big technology advance. The other technology advance, and I would suggest people sort of pulling this paper if they're interested in looking at it, Medicare has what's called a national coverage determination for when non-invasive ventilation should begin. The CMS coverage criterion, it's really very antiquated. It's not up to what was seen in other countries, and it's certainly not up to the technologies that we think are available today. My partner, John Coleman, and I, if you look in the journal Chest, in the articles that are in press for what's called ONMAP, which is the technical expert panel for NIV in the section on neuromuscular disease, you can see that we have new recommendations for the national coverage determination that include using new technologies such as home monitoring for spirometry, which can be done now with handheld devices, home monitoring of oxygen, home monitoring of CO2 testing. All of these things were not available technologies in the past. Now, not only are they available, but within the next 3 months, we're hoping that Medicare will update the national coverage determination to allow us to put these into real-time play.
A quick follow-up. Someone asked, what was the name of that remote O2 sensing device?
We're using the WatchPat, which is made by a company called Itamar, which is out of Caesarea in Israel. But they have an American branch to the company and manufacture devices out of Atlanta. And what we've loved about it is that if you have an issue with COVID in your institution, the device gets mailed straight from the factory to the patient. They never have to come in. The device doesn't have to be returned, and you get your data right away.
Thank you. I have another question for Dr. Brown, and then I have one for Lauren. So Dr. Brown, can you, this is from the live chat here, can you speak to your impressions about the expanded access as it relates to the Neuron product?
Yeah, well, that's all under review now. I think the Neuron trials have shown that in a particular stratum, a particular group of patients, there was some benefit. I think the issue is, what is the path forward to further assess that and to make that available for that group of people? You know, I think there are a lot of questions yet to be answered about that study. So I don't think one can draw any firm conclusions just yet. But as I think I said in my little talk, there's no question the cells themselves have potential benefit. The question is, who's the right population to get them?
Thank you. And does anyone else want to make a comment on that? I think that Dr. Driss?
No.
Okay.
I agree with Dr. Brown.
Perfect. I think we're probably all thinking that a lot, is we agree with Dr. Brown, and we're pleased to have you here. I get this coming up a lot in my clinics, and and this is also sort of paraphrase question I just got from the pre-submitted questions for Lauren about making decisions about and tough decisions that our patients have to think about, and unfortunately we have to introduce well before they're even needed in many cases, about non-invasive ventilation and feeding, and it sort of ties into this decision-making tools that we're working on. Perhaps you could comment a bit on that for us, Lauren? Sure,
and I'll actually, in the link, I'll send a sneak preview for the audience. I just got an A-OK to post it. So we've been working, building off of work from an Australian researcher, and there's also some folks in Europe who are working on decision-making tools to help patients clarify, to simplify medical decisions and to gauge their patient's preference, their values, and a patient decision tool. So we're working on an online interactive tool where people can answer questions and can view the decisions that they want to make. What Lisa was just talking about, NIV, with non-invasive ventilation. Once you guys go through the education process and are having the conversation, the decision-making tool is a way to reinforce, and also a way to have patients, people living with ALS and their caregivers, have a way to think through what their values are, what kinds of questions they want to talk with their physician. A gentleman who worked on his PhD, Jeremy Van Ness, around patient decision-making. He is actually a gentleman who has ALS. Really, it's a personal choice, and we have to really kind of walk through those decisions. And so our decision-making tool helps guide patients. And so that's a way that we're innovating, and it's a way that's different than traditional guides, although we do have some traditional guides available that we just revamped and redid. So I'll put that link in, and don't worry, you'll be getting updates about the tool and our progress. But I'm really excited because this is the first tool of its kind in the US, and we hope that this will improve patient outcomes Lisa was a huge help with working on the non-invasive ventilation tool.
Can I just add one thing, Lauren? Because I love the tool, and I think that it is a really important step forward. There was important work done several years ago showing that there are inequities in healthcare in terms of access to NIV. And the way that the research was done, and most of this was done in South Carolina through the clinic that has a large population of both African Americans and others. And one of the things that became obvious is that the inequity wasn't there because of a lack of devices. The devices were available for the whole clinic. The inequity is there because unless we could develop better ways of shared decision-making, we weren't going to truly be able to get rid of the inequities in healthcare, because that is the final obstacle. That shared decision-making is the difference between allowing a patient to take therapies and allowing a patient to understand their own role in it. And given everything that's gone on in the US in the last year, I have to applaud Lauren because it's the final biggest bridge.
We're looking forward to working with families and with, and I have to say, we had 28 patients living with ALS and caregivers review the new guides and the new materials, as well as numerous clinicians and advocates. So yes, addressing health inequities is a critical component. And I think having clearly laid out information is empowering patients. And so thank you for helping us work on that.
So my next question, I'll start with Dr. Driss, but anyone else feel free to join in afterwards. We get a lot of questions about PLS patients and sometimes maybe a sense that they're being left out of some of the clinical trials. So Dr. Driss, could you comment how a PLS patient, primary lateral sclerosis, could get involved with research both locally or nationally, and what's being done in that domain? And I'm sure Dr. Brown, Dr. Wolf, and Lauren may chime in afterwards.
Absolutely. It is an issue for PLS patients. They progress slowly. In a lot of the clinical trial, they need to see progression to make sure that the drug actually does something, right? That's what we rely on. And if we don't see progression at all in the placebo arm, it's going to be very difficult, very expensive to do a clinical trial that lasts years and years. So one way to resolve that issue is to have a surrogate of this progression, usually a biomarker. So that's why we're working very hard to develop those things that will allow a PLS patient or slowly progressing patient to participate in clinical trial. We're no longer worrying about their progression, but maybe we're targeting something on their imaging or in their blood that will change, and that change will be affected by the drug. We are participating in a preclinical trial now, clinical trial readiness. There is this natural history of primary lateral sclerosis that is spearheaded by Dr. Mitsumoto and Colombia. And the purpose is really to develop these tools, to have a way to measure progression in well-established PLS patient and early PLS patient, and see if we can develop these tools that will allow us to include PLS patient in clinical trial going forward. So I know they've been patient for a very long time, and I truly understand what they're going through.
Dr. Brown, do you want to comment?
No, really. I think when there is a slowly progressing disease, as you've just heard stated so clearly, having a good biomarker is clearly important in accelerating the overall testing, and also in, I think, augmenting one's confidence. You know, we study a neuropathy, for example, which is very, very devastating, but very slowly progressive, not lethal. And for example, in that, there's a very good blood marker, which is absolutely distinctly abnormal and readily measured. And, you know, at least when we try therapies in that family, we know we've made a difference in terms of the biomarker within about 6 weeks, whereas the follow-up period would take, you know, 3 or 4 years. So yeah, I agree with what we've just heard totally.
Great. I have just spreading the questions around. So I have another question that was pre-submitted that I think Dr. Wolf would be the best person to take hit on, which was, you know, what's the benefit of an interdisciplinary care for an ALS patient as opposed to sticking with the physician who initially diagnosed them?
So I think that everyone here works in an interdisciplinary model. But what I would say is that, you know, we think about ALS as a disease of muscles, but really it's a whole body systemic disease. We need to think about not just breathing, but nutrition. We need to think about social issues. We need to think about speech and communication. We need to think about how we're going to do rehab and which rehab therapies are going to be most important. And what we've frequently seen is that it's the synergy of having all of those professionals in the same room at the same time, giving each other feedback that makes the difference in terms of patient care. It's not necessarily easy for patients because it's a long day to do a multidisciplinary visit. That being said, it certainly beats coming back to the hospital most of the time. But more importantly, the communication between the patient and the team makes all the difference in the world. And I think one of the things that the National Institutes of Health has really started to emphasize to us is that the days where we live in siloed worlds, where neurologists are only with neurologists, physiatrists are only with physiatrists, et cetera, those days are over. Patient-centered care means that multidisciplinary becomes the model because the center is the patient and the condition, not the physician in their silo.
Can I add one thing? I think we've been focusing on clinical trial, and of course, clinical trial are important, but we should not forget what we do every day in multidisciplinary clinic when we take care of the patient. We follow the nutrition. We know that progression, weight loss is a negative prognostic factor. If we can keep patient from losing weight, we accomplish a lot. We can kind of slow down the progression of the disease. We know that patients who have access to non-invasive ventilation and start this early, it's actually proven to slow down the progression of the disease or expand their lifespan. So we do have we don't have true disease modifying, but treatment available, but we have changed the quality of life of our patient, and we did impact their survival just by having them attend multidisciplinary clinic and making sure they're seen by multiple specialists and addressing all the problems that come from nutrition, breathing, communication, and so forth.
I think the other component that we have at Northwestern is with the support services team who works with families from the foundation. And we really work in partnership with the multidisciplinary team at Northwestern. So we walk families through, that decision process that we were just talking about. And we have the luxury of more time than some of the clinicians, and to really help guide. And I think, decisions aren't just clear cut, it's emotions, and it's, the feelings behind decisions, and it's the community. So I'm a social worker. I always say we're person and environment, which means we don't make decisions in a vacuum. We make decisions together as a community. And I think that that's really important. And so that's one of the areas that the support services team, has been doing, since I think 1986 as well, when we brought in our first coordinator. So I really, it's an honor to work with families and to be with them on that journey. But it is, the patient-centered care that Lisa talked about. It's really getting to know the families and what their preferences are, and then helping guide and making them aware of all the different ways to mitigate the challenges of ALS.
All right, thank you. So I'm going to merge a couple concepts here for this question, because people are asking me in the questions that have been submitted in advance about why progress has been so slow. And I think that there's some lessons for people who've been through the whole session today in terms of the different talks and where the progression has been, the clinical translational efforts and some of the obstacles. That being said, I think this also ties in, if you will, with how amazing I think some of the patient-led initiatives have been. And I'll take an example, and there's many, but one person I follow on Twitter, and you can follow me on Twitter if you want, but who I find like one of the most compelling patients is Brian Wallach. And I know that there was a question about how we can make things move ahead forward and get more resources. So maybe comment a bit on how patient advocacy can make a difference. Things like in that particular example, like the Act for ALS that is moving through sorry, I'm Canadian, so I want to get it right. The Congress and the role for also you don't have to necessarily start your own organization, but for just simply sending a message to your state representative to support these types of things. Could people kind of comment on that? They could either sort of talk about the barriers to progress that we faced and reason, but also the ways for patients to be advocates. We'll start with Dr. Brown, if you don't mind.
Sure, no, thank you. I'm happy to take a stab at those questions. I mean, I think a lot of the challenge to progress has been just not knowing enough about the basic biology of the disease. All right, so that's one of the energy barriers, and that reflects many things, including, inadequacies in our knowledge about basic neuronal circuitry, about neurodevelopment, about the impact of aging on the brain. I mean, there are many basic issues that underlie ALS that are related to these basic biological questions. And so I think that's problem number one. Another problem is that unlike some tissues, for example, skeletal muscle, which one can observe in various ways, the brain is encased, of course, in a skull and is by design inaccessible. And you spoke so well about that in some of your discussions this morning, Dr. Franz. That's a second issue, is how does one interpret what's going on at either the cellular or the molecular basis in the living human brain? Obviously, iPSC cells have taken us a step towards solving that problem. I think a third issue has been, until recently, the fact that this disease, still defined as an orphan disease, did not attract enough attention of the deep-pocketed pharmaceutical industry to really make a difference in terms of the overall research momentum. I think that's changing wonderfully. There are probably 50 or 60 companies out there now that acknowledge having one or another kind of ALS research programs. So I think those are so the biology, the funding, I think the tenor of the pharmaceutical industries all have limited research progress. But I see all those things as changing. In terms of patient advocacy, there's no question that the field has benefited enormously from so many wonderful patient groups. You mentioned Brian Wallach. What he's done is spectacular. That's true of, you can go around almost every major city in the country, and there'll be some patient organization. We have some great organizations in Boston. There are great ones in New York City. I mean, so it goes. They're just, and what's interesting is that they often have different emphasis, which leads to different sort of sometimes complementary, I think, strengths as in the ALS fight. I do wish that patient groups could coordinate to a better degree. I think there's often a sense of competition for limited dollars, and to find a way to get this wonderful group of people to work more coordinately, I think would help us all. But in general, I think the impact has been enormous, Dr. Franz.
Thank you. Dr. Driss.
I can add just one thing. One thing that frustrates me a lot is really the delay in diagnosis. I wish that my patient would come to me way earlier. I usually see them, and Dr. Brown had said this in his presentation, it takes about a year from the onset of the first symptom to when the patient presents in a multidisciplinary clinic and has access to a clinical trial. So it's unfortunate. Time is brain cells, time is neurons. So until we discover a way to speed up that process, it's gonna that one would be one thing that will remain an obstacle to advancing these kind of treatment for ALS.
And I guess on that note, there's a specific question about how many patients are still in that category, which is a research category more so than something that everyone has to rely on in day-to-day clinical practice, perhaps, but of suspected versus positive or probable, or definite ALS. Sorry, I'm getting.
Are you asking about the?
I think I think the question from Dr. Angus is about maybe at any given time a cross section of clinic, how many patients have a probable or definite diagnosis versus suspected.
Well, the earlier you see them, the less likely they're going to be probable or even definite. They're going to be either probably possible. I don't have numbers because we don't use the criteria clinically. We use them for research when we're trying to enroll patient clinical trial. And it's really, I don't think the patient have to worry about that. But unfortunately, when you're doing a clinical trial, you have to try and have a homogeneous set of patients. The problem with ALS is if it doesn't look the same, we take two patients with ALS, we put them together, they will talk, and they will discover that each one of them has his own ALS in a way. So that's the purpose of trying to resolve that issue and make sure we have homogeneity in patients. So that's a kind of an artificial construct to be able to do clinical trial. But beyond that, when we see patients just clinically, they will present a little bit later than we want them to present. Unfortunately, they get interventions, surgery that sometimes are not needed. And we need to do a better job educating our medical students, our residents to recognize this disease and refer those patients earlier rather than later.
Colin, can I just say one thing? I think Senda, Dr. Driss, you definitely hit that as we look at these new treatments, and we're working towards finding treatments that work. The earlier the better, and having that earlier diagnosis is so important. But I wanted to get back to the congressional hearing, the Act for ALS. So IMALS, MDA, ALS Association, Les Turner were all, supporters of this bill, and a number of other ALS organizations. And what I've seen that's been really interesting in the last, 5 years, and I've worked with families for over 20 years, but what is really exciting to me is the energy of the ALS research advocates, and they're really pushing for new pathways, to fund treatment as well as to accelerate research in the development of ALS. And so Act for ALS is a bill. And so I think, Colin, you might have mentioned on November 4th, there's going to be a congressional hearing. So there's information on the advocacy pages of those organizations if you want to get involved.
Thank you, Lauren. That's fantastic. Actually, just a spontaneous kind of question here is the point about there being so many different organizations, and how that structure can sometimes, obviously there's a tremendous upside, but how that could be coordinated. But maybe we could comment on how there's so many different ALS centers and there's so many different ALS research groups and collaborations, but sometimes it doesn't seem like everyone's talking. And, is there something that we need to be, this could be too philosophical, but something we need to be doing differently in how we reward people's contribution, for teamwork, that you don't have the entire story by yourself, but that you move the ball forward?
This is Lisa. What I will say about that is that from the pulmonary side of things, what we have noticed is that there is a significant lack in training for pulmonologists on the care of patients with ALS. And we knew that the only way that we were going to change that is if we went to all of our different organizations and asked them to support a component of pulmonary training. And we've definitely seen that. The American College of Chest Physicians is now working with us. Andreas Paulsbachmann, who is our head for the Les Turner Foundation, has worked with chest. The American Thoracic Society is now working with us as well in terms of training programs and putting those together. And there's now been an editorial in Lancet Neurology that came from John Hansen-Flaschen out of Penn saying that all pulmonary training programs need to add training for ALS as part of their competencies. And what I will say is that failure for us to act in unison as one community would mean that we would fail completely in the educational mission that we have. I think you wanted to know more about the research component to that, and I'm going to throw that to Dr. Brown, but I can tell you from the educational component, I feel that it is one of my most important jobs that I reach out and integrate with my community locally and nationally.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add to that. I mean, I think what you said makes good sense. So.
Yeah, I think there's structural barriers I see sometimes too with the way that sometimes we depend on certain funding sources, and that I feel like the research is sometimes maybe a few years behind our ideas, and that sort of can be always a challenge, but is also hard to do. You know, like when you think about the NIH model, for example, versus direct funding of research by patient groups in terms of risk taking. But I guess that is something that there's probably not we're not going to solve today on the panel. There's so many questions. I'm panicking here because I don't know how we're going to get to them all. But since let's build on this conversation about early diagnosis. Why isn't there an ALS stress test? You know, like in cardiology, what can we do? What's going to let us identify patients sooner? We're going to have treatments that are going to maybe depend on this, or combinations of treatments. Is it going to be just a biomarker in the spinal fluid, like neurofilament light chain or heavy chain, or what else is coming down there in terms of early detection?
Yeah,
genetics, I suppose, as well, and maybe we could link that with the genetic testing question that I've got. Yeah.
Well, I mean, one of the issues that I think bears on this is organizing studies of people who are known to carry. This is now familial more than sporadic, but who are known to carry mutations that can cause ALS, and following them pre-symptomatically, both to be able to find the disease when it occurs early, but also to learn how to find the disease. I mean, there are 3 or so efforts now in the United States to do exactly that, to have longitudinal follow-up of pre-symptomatic carriers, in the hopes that by minutely analyzing every possible aspect of the clinical phenotype, body fluids, and so forth, it will be possible to find the earliest signal that denotes the start of the disease. We need to do that, and it needs to be done probably over a long term. Now, there have been other approaches, which others know far more about than I, but for example, a study was done a few years back looking at medical records using AI, I think, to say what's in common in the earliest symptoms and complaints of patients with ALS. And it's not entirely surprising that things like new onset or cramps, for example, was a red flag that often denoted the earliest onset of the disease. So can we put together not only studies to study pre-symptomatic carriers, but ways to monitor, for example, clinical records using electronic records to try to detect combinations of symptoms that may be much more abundant in people who have early ALS, so that we could at least be alerted to that and flag that for clinicians for possible referral for neurological assessment. I'd love to know what Dr. Driss thinks about this. She's probably thought a lot about it over the years.
Yes, I agree with you. And it's easier in a centralized healthcare system to do that. The problem also, we have a unique healthcare system that is very decentralized, makes it a little bit harder to kind of do those kind of things. But I agree. I think there's multiple areas where we need to improve on. We need to improve our education. We need to improve our biomarker detection. But in the hand of the expert, the diagnosis is not difficult. It's unfortunately very deceiving and very easy diagnosis. So the question is how, I mean, and it's been developed. I mean, there is a group in NEALS working actually on this, to come up with a tool that will help the PCP or the general neurologist to ask questions and identify, get red flags about ALS and send the patient to specialist. They have that in amyloid, for example. There's red flags that even though amyloid is so rare compared to ALS. So I think I'm hopeful that those things will develop.
Yeah.
Kind of, we feel in a different, we live now in a different area after the Ash Bucket Challenge. I think the awareness has increased these last years compared to what it was even 10 years ago. So things are moving in the right direction. I'm hopeful.
But Senda, can I ask a question?
Of course.
Obviously, genetics is not going to be, perfect for everyone. But why is it that genetic testing in these patients is the last thing we do, not the first thing? Would putting genetics much closer to the time of the complaint help with trying to speed these things through?
Yes, we've changed actually. We do try and send genetic testing as early as we can. It is limited. We only work with one genetic counselor, which is a little bit of a bottleneck. But overall, genetic testing is much easier now compared to what it was even a couple of years ago. So yes, if it is just 10% of the patient that we're going to identify, I think it's important, especially for the C9. We have many surprises, many patient tests. I mean, there's 5% of the sporadic that may have C9. So yeah, we're working on that. We're trying to do genetic testing when we see the patient earlier. And you're right, if that is more mainstream, it will help identify those patients even earlier, especially the ones that don't have a family history.
Again, I'm sorry. I was just going to make one point, which is that it's the mainstream that's the problem. It's the fact that the general neurologists that are seeing these patients first have no access to genetic counselors and don't feel comfortable doing genetic testing. Do we need to start looking at changing the curriculum?
You got muted.
Sorry. Do we need to change the neurology curriculum to start saying to general neurologists, hey, it's okay to start taking genetic testing as an option?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think there is a lot we can do as educator to improve that. What I feel happens with the general neurologists is they do make the diagnosis of ALS, but they're so afraid of missing other things that will delay sending the patient somewhere because they're trying to rule out many other things. So that's, I think, the problem with them. So genetic testing will help do that. Yes, why not?
I think it's so important, for the genetic testing component to have that, and to go through genetic counseling. So you're really making those informed decisions. And now there's free testing services available for people to utilize for genetic tests. And that's been a big help because that was an initial barrier. And I think it's changing practice, of neurologists that is really going to be incorporated because as we've seen in other neuromuscular diseases, we need to prime the community to be ready and prepared for new treatment trials. So people are aware of their status if they want to be aware, right? So not everybody who wants to have that information, that's very powerful personal information. But people need to know what their options are so they can make informed decisions.
Any financial barriers that we could comment on how we can help alleviate those? Because I know that maybe the difference between sending a panel versus a whole exome or whole genome sequencing for patients who are interested.
The price came down tremendously, but free testing is only open for a patient who have family history. It's not open for everybody, but the price has come down I mean, I don't think that finances are the current barrier to that. I think access to it and having patient actually send it is the issue, and genetic counseling is the main issue. I think there was a question about EMG and how important is the EMG for the diagnosis of ALS. It is very important, unfortunately, and it has to be done by expert also. That's why patients end up having multiple ones. So it's the diagnosis is done with multiple things. You have the history, the physical exam, the EMG, the imaging, and then you put all that together and you come up with a conclusion. So every single one is kind of a link in a chain that when you need them all, and you need them all done well, so you come up to the right conclusion. Somebody who has an EMG done on one limb, for example, when he has weakness, and sometimes even we can see changes on the EMG even before the weakness can present, is important to have a comprehensive EMG. I do understand it's a painful test, so and I do understand that patients sometimes have multiple of these, so I'm very empathetic about it.
And I do hear a lot, I mean, and sometimes I say this to people as well, there's not one test by itself that, for the vast majority of patients, other than people with maybe a mutation that's known to cause the disease in the family history. But that's a relatively small group. There's not one test that makes the diagnosis by itself, but I think, Dr. Driss, you made a great point that as much as we can make it seem like it's really hard to diagnose the disease in front of the right person, the diagnosis doesn't, the delay to diagnosis, once you reach the interdisciplinary clinic level and get an expert evaluation, perhaps isn't as daunting as advertised. Is Dr. Brown or Dr. Driss, do you want to comment on that?
Why don't you start, Dr. Driss?
And you might be still muted there, Dr. Driss.
Yes, as I said earlier, I mean, the diagnosis is really deceiving. How many diseases could give you upper and lower motor neuron changes in one limb? So already you see that and we do have also the luxury of seeing this patient a year into their disease. So it becomes more obvious. Maybe we'll go through the same kind of skepticism if we see them very early on. But I think even if you see them early on, once we rule out all the mimicker, I think it's safe to tell patient that maybe this is what it is. And we always reevaluate. Of course, if patient stops progressing or patient gets better, of course, we reevaluate the diagnosis. Nothing is ever set in stone. Yeah, I mean, it's unfortunately not a very difficult diagnosis when it's manifested. We've all seen it.
That's right. Not much to add to that. I think so much of what we do is excluding other entities now, obviously to the extent that we can find mutations early on, that changes the bias, that changes, in fact, the way we use the Ellis-Coriel diagnostic criteria. I mean, I envision a point down the line where we will all have our genome scanned for not just 50 or 55 of the now genetically important diseases, but probably 350 or 400. And that panel will include all the ALS genes, all the muscular dystrophy genes. And, that's a body of information that our physicians will have, and that will condition the whole way that we approach the early diagnosis of these diseases. I mean, I think we're not very far away from that now, right? I mean, we do a heel stick on every baby born in most major cities to look for things like phenylketonuria. And I can easily imagine that we'll do that, and we'll put together a chip that has all of the treatable, early diagnosable genes that we need to know about. So, I think that's where we're going to go down the line.
Yeah, I think
I want to just make sure we're not saying that every single patient should go there and get genetic testing right away, because I saw some of the question asking about that. I think the first thing to do is probably to get proper genetic counseling to know exactly what you're getting yourself into.
I agree.
Right, you do need to know what you're getting yourself into in terms of the implications, not just on you, but also on other people, children and other people in your family when you go down. So you should go in, I think, properly informed of what you're doing and any implications it may have. That's a great point. I mean, we've got Dr. Brown here, so I have to, and there's some questions and I apologize for people who want to hear them reiterate it, but I know that this is being recorded and taped, and there's great information. I'll just point out on tofersen, on some of the SOD1 and C9 gene therapy, on Stathman too, you know, like some of these questions I've got here that I feel really guilty I'm not asking them, but they are in some of the earlier content. I want to ask a question that hasn't been covered yet. That's a really, really, really hard one. I've asked it to Dr. Siddiq a few times as well. I feel like people like Dr. Brown and Dr. Siddiq are uniquely qualified to comment on ALS reversals. And have you ever seen one? And what medication or what was associated with the reversal? And it comes up so often, I think, also in questions that the doctors don't get from patients, but are on chat forums. Yeah,
you know, there are publications on reversals. Rick Bedlack has published probably 45 or so that he's pulled together, and he's got another 30 or so. And I've called him actually within the last month just to talk about that very question. The answer is I have not personally myself seen a reversal from what I would call true ALS. I'm sure they exist. I don't doubt that for a moment. And I know Rick is convinced that they exist. I have seen them in the context of no therapy. I've seen them in the context, reported in the context of complex therapies. But I find it very hard thus far to extract any single ready explanation that allows either a new pathway to therapy or better understanding. I wish, I mean, it's absolutely critical that we catalog all those cases and study them as fully as we can. But, you know, I don't, other than what the good work that Rick has done, I don't think enough of that has been done to allow us to really learn as much as we should from them.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for that. I'm not sure anyone will want to add to that, but I think Dr. Driss, do you have any comments?
I think the question is, and I think Dr. Bedlack is doing very thoroughly, is the diagnosis of ALS correct from the beginning? Are these truly ALS patients that had stopped, their disease stopped or got better, or were these misdiagnosed, like they were ALS mimicker and somehow they kind of did not evolve the same way? So that, I think that's the most important question that will need to be addressed. And when Dr. Bedlack reviews these records, he pays close attention to that. This will be easier answered down the line when we have biomarker, when we have a blood test that will tell us, okay, this is ALS. So it makes it easy to know. Now we can't. I personally have never seen him. I asked Dr. Siddiq the same question. He responded the same way that Dr. Brown did. But I think it's important to know how the diagnosis was made, by who also, and recording these cases is very important.
Yeah, it's such an interesting topic. I have, of course, nothing to add other than just the amazement. I know that Dr. Siddiq told me stories about traveling all over the world to try to track down cases like this, and the passion for trying to, because, you know, there's things we can learn, of course, in our practice, but also seeing these things that just happen, and trying to take that to our research, that idea of reverse translation, which is so, I think, fundamental to where a lot of some of the research talked about today, like a patient-induced pluripotent stem cell, for example, and taking it into that type of approach to inspire your research direction. You know, one of the things that has come up just as a logistics thing is, like, there's been so much great content today. Lauren, what are we going to do to make sure that people can look up things that we alluded to earlier that they may not have been able to listen to or had to step away? Can you talk about when this is going to be up on YouTube, or how people can access this?
Dr. Franz, you were in my head. Yes, I just posted all the presentations will be recorded and will be available on the Les Turner website. I don't have an exact timing of that as soon as we edit, because we just want to cut up. It's been a very long day. Thank you to everyone who's been with us since 9 o'clock this morning. And we just need to edit, and then we will get those recordings up. And we'll send a note to everyone who registered to let them know that the recordings are now available.
All right, Dr. Wolf.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Are you still with us?
I am.
Okay. I have a specific question from Callie. What do you recommend about mucolytics in the nebulizer and concentrated saline versus NAC? Very specific question. Maybe you could kind of give us a little bit of an intro to what she's talking about and then answer the question.
Okay, so there are several things that we need to know about handling secretions in patients with ALS. The first is a lot of the secretions, I'm going to go nose and down, that normally you'd be able to blow and clear your nose. You can't do that because of the weakness. So we do teach patients how to clear their nose by using a cough assist machine. There are YouTube videos on how to do that, and we do recommend that. The next thing is in secretions that are very thick, they are more likely to be a problem than thin secretions. So we do recommend avoiding things that can really over thicken secretions. And nebulized duoneb has ipratropium in it that can be an issue for patients that are over thick. That's the biggest mistake we see, and we recommend avoiding it. In terms of the N-acetylcysteine or in terms of other mucolytics like mucor mist, we have found that they are helpful in some patients, not the large percentage of patients, but in sporadic patients. The nice thing is there's no downside to those drugs. They don't have a side effect to them. So if patients wanted to try them, they're cheap, they're easily available, and if they're helpful, that means you're one of the people for whom that is helpful. The other thing is we do recommend that patients look at using vibratory therapies that can help to loosen thick secretions to get them up and out. Typically in the past, that had been the use of a therapy vest, but it's difficult because Medicare won't allow you to get both a therapy vest and a cough assist. And in addition, the vest itself is not easily tolerated in some patients with G-tubes who find that it's uncomfortable because the force on the chest and shaking the body can be uncomfortable. And so we're now using a new device. It's called the Velara, which includes both nebulization together with vibration, and that combination has been much more successful for us. We did a preliminary data study for which we've only published an abstract form, but we're looking forward to doing expanded enrollment so that we can get it published in a peer-reviewed form as well. And the only other thing that I would say that we are doing now that we were not doing as much the last time we met, and this is a COVID thing as well in some ways, the use of Botox therapy for saliva can be very helpful, especially in patients who already have a G-tube. But the problem with Botox is it needs to be redone every 2 to 3 months. And then in the setting of COVID, when patients are not really wanting to come down to the hospital as much, instead we're doing radiotherapy, which has been published by several groups, especially a nice publication by Dr. Kiskinis, and I'm sorry, not Dr. Kiskinis. I'm sorry, I'm getting all mixed up. The group in Kentucky. And so we would recommend.
You meant Kasarskas.
Because I know, I just can't say it. Are you going to say it for me, Senda? Kasarskas.
No,
Thank you. See? This is why I need Senda. That's why Senda said we can't be without each other. Dr. Kasarskas' group did present the protocol, and that's been published. And we have found that it's helpful because once treatment is done, after 5 treatments, they're done. And they don't have to keep coming back to the hospital over and over again. So that's been very helpful.
Thank you. I have a question for in the live chat here. For Dr. Brown, can you tell us what type of treatments moving forward might be able to help those of us already with advanced ALS? And that's always obviously a tough question, both from the clinical trial and inclusion criteria, as well as things like you pointed out earlier in your presentation about trying to stop or reverse the disease in someone with more advanced pathology.
Yeah, I don't know that I have a particularly insightful answer. I mean, I think one of the points to emphasize is that we need to know what we mean by advanced ALS. Is there some point beyond which further treatment is not necessary? Well, it depends who you talk to. If someone is communicating by moving 3 extraocular muscle movements, that person might argue that saving those movements is absolutely critical to communication and quality of life, even though one is completely plegic otherwise, right? So should we be any less aggressive for someone who is communicating that way, but is completely paralyzed, than someone who has nothing more than just one-sided wrist problem? Okay, that's a very important philosophical question. So putting that aside, you know, the real question is, what is the realm of therapies that we have? And of course, that's a huge, huge discussion. But in addition to the, depending on how you count them, 2 or 3 FDA-approved therapies, you know, whether you count Nuedexta or not, with its potential neuroprotective properties, there's an enormous armamentarium of things that have some rationale that are used even before FDA approval. And we tend to use those multiply, starting one at low dose, then another, and then a third, and layering them on one after another to the extent that we can do so safely. You know, there are probably 6 or 7 different compounds that one can use that are not FDA approved, that nonetheless have a fairly strong rationale in an otherwise dreadful disease where we want to do anything we can to be helpful. I don't know if that answers your question, Dr. Franz, but that's a key question. And a lot depends on how you define what late stage means. And I'm not trying to be cute. I think it's a very important question. You know, because retaining those last few motor neurons can be pivotal in both communication and quality of life.
Dr. Brown, can I add one extra thing for you to address in this?
Of course.
There initially were many trials that said, hey, if you're using non-invasive ventilation, you're too late in disease, we won't put you into the trial. That's been loosened now in many trials to say that if you are a candidate for NIV, that you can use it and remain in the trial.
Right.
The thing that I am concerned about is that the trials are not following whether or not patients have been using the device. What's their compliance? We know from the Cleopa study and from the Bork study and from the Berlowitz study that compliance makes a difference. Should we be following NIV use as these guys are in trial? Because it may be impacting their outcome regardless of the drug.
Yeah, it's a good point. Very good point. We need to know that. It's a very, very, very key point.
I'm going to actually prompt Dr. Driss on this as well, because I know we've talked about this key thing about what a person values themselves when it comes, for example, to treating an adult with SMA, spinal muscular atrophy, and where we've had greater success, I think, with gene therapy in that group. And for example, the functional goal of just controlling a power wheelchair and maintaining that function clearly has value that's not captured in many of the scores insurance companies want to look at for global function. Could you comment a bit more on that, Dr. Driss? We talk about this a lot. I know you.
I think it depends on the drug we have. If we have a very powerful drug that's going to preserve every single motor neuron, then that's, I agree, is a philosophical question. Who are we to decide that somebody who has eye movement only is not as worthy as somebody who's moving arms and legs? That's not our decision to make. But I think that discussion comes, it depends on how powerful a drug we have. If we have a not so powerful drug and we have to start very early to preserve a lot, way more motor neuron, then that's the problem. We have to treat patient early on and not wait until they have very limited number of these available. So I think that is the question.
I apologize, but I have to break for a 4:30 meeting. So I just want to thank everyone on the panel and everyone more generally for the chance to participate today. It's been a great series of discussions. And I thank you very much.
We thank you too.
Thank you, Dr. Brown.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Yeah.
And Dr. Brown let me know that he was under some time constraints. So I tried to give him a lot of the questions early on. I saved some of the hardest ones now for Dr. Driss and Dr. Wolf and Lauren to address now. I'm only partly joking. Dr. Wolf, what do you have to say?
I wanna Senda to answer one more question relative to the SMA model for these drugs. I agree with you. Who am I to make a judgment call in terms of the quality of life? That being said, when we're looking at drugs that for an individual patient may be $500,000 at a shot, somebody is going to have to make that quality assessment. How do we deal with the cost factor that are involved in these new agents?
Yeah, this is something I grapple with since the very early drugs, since the Pompe drugs came around. I don't think I have an answer for that. It is true. I mean, this is difficult. Yeah, I totally agree. I don't know how to answer this question.
I think we answer it by working with families together and having and really talking with advocates and finding new ways to address these very important research questions and very practical. It's not just the FDA, it's CMS is our next battle, right? That's what I've always, we need to always keep our eye on that.
It is unfortunate that many times the physician are put in a situation where they have to be making those choices that they actually cannot make. It's at the end of the day, it's the insurance companies and it's the, as you said, CMS that's going to decide who gets what. And I wish this gets actually taken care of way ahead, not having to deal with it at the end. And it will make us as physicians not look really good when we're trying to minimize and or think about where would the drug make the most impact. So it's complicated. But I guess, I don't know, down the line, that would be a good problem to have, right? In ALS, we'll think about it at that time.
Right, yeah, and in some countries, it's the government as well, if it's not there's always, different people who are involved in making that decision. In some ways, it's a challenge, but it's also, someone has to play that role, whether it be insurance, government, and of course, we try to, I think physicians advocating for their patients as much as possible and being as greedy as possible to get as much for every patient is kind of my approach.
Yeah, and this is where the discussion between the patient and the physician is important. I mean, we have a heart-to-heart discussion and be kind of transparent about what the actual benefit versus cost and versus, like, for example, if I use the example of Spinraza, every 4 months coming in having a spinal tap, for some patient it's easy, for other it may not be worth it. So it's, again, that is a discussion to kind of outweigh the risk and benefit of doing those things.
All right, Lauren, I have a question for you. A lot of patients have asked us in the pre-submitted questions, and it's comes up naturally in clinical life. How do I find out about clinical trials? What's going on in Chicago? What's going on at Northwestern? What's available in Canada, the United States, et cetera? Because these don't just come to the physicians, they come to us, but they come to the organization, the Les Turner Foundation. What would you say to that question?
Well, I think one of the really nice tools that we have available to us is the ALS signal from IMALS. And I'll put that in the chat there. It's a really handy way to research and to look. I also added Northwestern specific information, the trials that Dr. Driss is involved with, and she can probably talk a little bit more about what trials they're currently doing. But I really think talking with your physician, making sure that you have your medical records, and figuring out what is an appropriate trial for you to participate in. And even if it's not a clinical intervention, there's so many studies that are out there and are available for observation, and also that people can participate in different ways. And so again, I think for interventional studies, IMALS signal, Northwestern, I put the link there for the studies that are happening across the country, and talking with other people living with ALS. And I know Niels also has for folks who, you know, we have 20 people from 20 different countries here and folks from all across the US participating. So those are some of the big websites that I would visit, would be Neil's. And then of course, in Europe, there's other sites as well.
All right. Anything else to add, Dr. Driss or Dr. Wolf even about this? I know we answer these questions a lot. I think Lauren did a good job.
No, I think I just want to make sure that I know that many of the clinical trial participants are probably listening. I want to make sure that they understand how important and how grateful I am to their participation. These are completely selfless patients who put themselves out there, coming in every single visit, absorbing all that comes with the problem of having to be in a clinical trial, following everything we tell them to the letter. And I'm really impressed and I really thank them. And they actually are the ones moving the field forwards. For the patient who cannot participate in clinical trial, there are other things that are available to them. And I don't want them to feel bad that they're left out or anything. So make sure to have a good discussion with your physician. There will always be something that you can participate in. And do understand that what you're doing is selfless and is for advancing the field forward. Don't expect anything to come out of this. I mean, we hope that some of these treatment will stop disease or will slow down progression, but the trials are trials and they're artificial. So you will not feel that or you will not see that unless we have a very, very huge impact. So I just want to take this opportunity and really thank them, because without them, there'll be no clinical trials.
I think that's something that people, you know, I always try to emphasize to people that the whole point of, you know, it's exciting to maybe be able to be eligible for a clinical trial, especially if it's something that that you've heard about or that has a lot of buzz around it in terms of different types of interventions. But you know, when you really look at the trials, you know, what you're doing is actually, as much as you might be happy to be in it, you're doing an enormous service to the ALS community by participating in any clinical research, and particularly clinical trial, because there's no guarantee that you're going to benefit from it. That's why it's a research study in these cases. And so I think that can't be overstated. And I think that I totally agree with you on that, Dr. Wolf. I want to ask, well, I actually want to answer one question. The one question that's directed to me, I can understand why there's not a lot. Because I usually just will ask Dr. Wolf or Dr. Driss the answers to the questions anyways, and then so we might as well just hear from them. But I will answer the one on BDNF. So what we were looking at was a question of, would you see that we had studied earlier, we were talking about our studies where we have a gene variation in this brain-derived neurotrophic factor. That's fairly common, actually. That's what got our interest in it. About 30% of the population carries. And then we had talked around some of our reverse translation. So we took it because it was affecting neurotrauma outcomes in rehab patients. So we took it to the lab and found that it had some impact on motor neuron survival when we applied mechanical force, like a stretch injury in a dish. And there's a question, do you see this with concussions or TBI? And actually that was the original question that the collaborator I have at the University of Illinois in Chicago, John Finan, got me into this because he wanted to model concussions and TBI. And so we started using the same cell line. Actually, the first thing I was doing with it was making cortical neurons in a dish. And so we do see very similar results with those neurons as well. All of it's unpublished. And so then to make it even more intriguing in the context of ALS is, of course, these questions we're getting about, like, could TBI, could neurotrauma, could this cause ALS or contribute to ALS in some patients? And so with that segue, I thought maybe I'd invite Dr. Driss to comment on that association between whether it's brain injury or other toxins or environmental exposures as triggers for ALS. And if you could comment a bit on that for us.
I have a very quick comment to that. I think what triggers ALS is a combination of two things: bad genes, bad environment. So it's unfortunate some people do have some genetic predisposition to develop ALS, and some patient will be exposed to environment. We don't necessarily know exactly which one is the worst, but we know that certain, like pesticide, chemicals, organic chemicals, electric shocks, injury, hit to the head, those kind of things could probably in a specific kind of in this specific genetic background will trigger the disease. I know it's vague, but I think that's the best information we have. Smoking also was found to, not in women, but in men, to kind of be a bad risk factor. So more reason to kind of stop smoking if you are.
Just real quick, Senda, two things. First of all, I'm a pulmonologist. You shouldn't smoke whether you're a man or a woman. But the other thing that I wanted to remind folks of is that if you develop ALS and you are a veteran, please contact your local VA. Because of a class action suit, you would become automatically 100% service connected. That may be due to head traumas, that may be due to chemical associations, et cetera. But it will increase access to support and therapy. And if no one else, we can help you through the Paralyzed Veterans of America and through our clinics to help get more services.
There was a question specifically about using Botox in ALS patients. I think that was referring to injecting the salivary glands, which is an accepted indication for controlling like sialorrhea or drooling. Okay, and then because there is warnings as well of using toxin as something that can induce weakness for patients with ALS. So it does deserve some discussion with your physician if you pursue that treatment. But it is possible. And I had a question for Dr. Wolf about someone who was diagnosed with bulbar ALS, had early breathing and swallowing problems, and wanted to know about exercises or other treatments they could do to improve, those impairments.
So in terms of exercises, there are a couple of things that we recommend for inspiratory and expiratory muscle strength training. That has been supported through a lot of work through speech and language pathologists, both here and throughout the US. That is helpful early on. And there are a bunch of devices. We recommend the breather just because it's easy to access, and relatively cheap. Emily Plowman's lab in Florida just uses an expiratory muscle strength trainer. We use the combination inspiratory, expiratory. However, past very early stages in disease, we think that the combination of lung volume recruitment along with expiratory coughing is a better combination, because lung volume recruitment reduces atelectasis or collapse of the lung bases. That reduces the amount of work of breathing that you have to do. It reduces mucus being stuck into the lungs. It helps people to reduce pneumonia, both by getting rid of that mucus and by helping them to eat and swallow with less aspiration. Because when you have a larger, more open lung, it's less work to breathe, and therefore you can swallow more easily. So we start with something very mild, like a muscle strength trainer. Then we would recommend going to a lung volume recruitment device, like an ambu bag with a one-way valve. And that is something that can be used continually through disease. In those patients who develop significant hand issues and can no longer use an ambu bag, that's when we recommend starting with a mechanical cough assist, which can also be used to provide lung volume recruitment.
I have a very, I get really excited for the diaphragm questions. It's become a big focus of for us. So thanks for commenting on that. I have to credit you for even getting me to think about putting an ultrasound over the chest to look at a diaphragm directly. It's become something that's really useful clinically. I'm hearing from a much higher authority that we need to start thinking about how we're going to wrap up the session. I was actually thinking about that anyways, Telly, but I appreciate you're always on it and keeping us. So there's one important thing before, and then maybe we can make a couple final comments. One is there's a survey, and I don't have a script for how to introduce that, but I bet Lauren and tell people about how they can kind of give us some feedback, because we got to keep making this thing better. I could even see from those old flyers Hyundai showed us at the beginning about the way it's progressed. You can see that this has become hopefully better and better as time goes on under her leadership and everyone's being involved. So Lauren, survey.
I just posted the link in the survey, as Telly did too. And we'll also send you an email to ask you to complete the surveys.
Okay, I'm gonna just say I am terribly sorry for the questions I didn't get to. I really tried. I know we tried to get to some of them in the live chat, so I'm so sorry about that. And I just want to just say we have got 2 minutes left. Dr. Driss leads our clinic.
Well, I want to
maybe put a couple comments together and set this off.
I want to first thank you. You've been an amazing moderator. You did an excellent job. It's great to have you. And I want to also thank my fellow panelists, Dr. Brown, unfortunately left, Lauren, and Lisa. We've worked together over the years. We're kind of a tight group. We also I would like to know if these clinical panels, we've been doing them, are they helpful? Give us feedback on this. We want to know if we should continue them in the future or do another format. We want to evolve as well. But this has been really an extraordinary day. I learned a lot, and it's always fun to be able to answer questions from patients. I love doing that with the backup I have, like Lisa and Lauren behind me.
And I teased Telly earlier, but thanks to her, of course, Dr. Ozdinler for organizing. The amount of work that we got from tech support and everyone involved, especially Telly coordinating this, has been incredible. I could be missing people, and of course, it's only because my mind is deficient, but not because we don't love you guys, and we appreciate everything you do. And then on the next phase of what we're doing here, there's actually a video that we wanted to show, and then stick around at the end of the video for the center video. And then we have Andrea Bachman, and I'll introduce her for some final remarks.
So the idea behind the center is to have 3 components: basic science research, clinical care, and patient care. And all 3 of these components are being supported by the Les Turner Foundation.
When patients are diagnosed with ALS and they come to our clinic, they don't just see the neurologist. It's a one-stop shop where they see many professionals at one place.
The clinicians that are taking care of ALS patients and the basic science researchers that are studying ALS are really partners. We really talk to each other. Observations made with patients sometimes lead to curiosities and trigger a new area of research, and sometimes new areas of research turn into new therapies for patients. And to bridge the gap between the basic science research and the clinical care is where I feel the Les Turner Foundation can make its greatest contribution.